All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining another Prog Report podcast. We've done a number of top 5 podcasts. We've had some amazing special guests. We've covered some humongous bands, some lesser known acts that maybe deserve more attention. And we've been lucky enough to have a bunch of great guests come in. You could check out all the previous podcasts on iTunes, Google Play, our YouTube channel, on our Facebook page, progreport.com. It's all there. And thank you, everybody, for listening and checking out everything. We're going to do something a little bit different today because typically the discussions have revolved around one particular band, talking about their albums or songs or that type of thing. But, as debates go, there is fewer relevant debates than best drummer. So we have to try and approach that, and we'll probably eventually get into guitarists and singers and so on. And there's way too many to cover to justify picking only top 5. So we have 2 more guests here, and really we're covering a lot here. So I'm going to introduce these 2 guys coming from different worlds, and we'll explain how the discussion is going to go. My first guest is Kyle Fagala. Did I say your last name right? Is that right?
Sometimes I wish it were pronounced differently, but it's actually Fagala. So you just got to go for it.
Okay. All right. Yeah. There you go. And a good friend, drummer in his own right, and a big fan of, Neil Morrison, Mike Portnoy. I think you run one of the forums online, I believe.
Yeah, I started the Mike Portnoy forum.
That's right. And, knows those guys well. And he loves to get into these drum discussions. So I thought he'd be a great person to bring on board and throw his 2 cents in. And then we also, we like to have great musicians on board that are experts in their field. Randy McStine is joining us, who's an amazing musician, guitar player, singer, songwriter in a number of bands. Randy, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So what we decided to do, we were talking about how to do this podcast, and if you decided to do just top 5, you run the risk of really excluding a lot. If we were all covering all years together, there's every chance that Peart, or Mike Portnoy ends up number 1 or number 2 on all our lists, that type of thing. So, we need to expand this a little bit more. So we've divided into 3 eras of prog. Randy is going to be responsible for the sort of classic era of prog, which is, we're going to say 70s to early 80s, give or take a year or 2. And that'll cover a good amount of fantastic drummers and a difficult challenge. I have no idea. We haven't discussed who our people are. So I have no idea where he's going. Kyle is going to do sort of the 90s, I guess late 80s to about 2005, covering sort of the second wave there, which are a lot of guys that I think we all know and love. And I am going to tackle the modern era of drummers. So, and sort of the way we're looking at it is, yes, drummers like, Neil from Rush or Mike Portnoy and so on have been in multiple decades, in some, 30, 40 years they've been playing. So we're going to stick them in the era that they're most defined with. And we'll try to do this as best as we can without offending the drummers themselves. But this is all in good fun. And if we left out your favorite drummer, please don't kill us online. All right. So that being said, a lot of introduction.
We want to go chronological here.
At least
you got to. We're Prog fans.
At least by the era.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Well, the order of your 5 through 1 is who you think is 5th through 1. That does not have to be in any specific order other than what you decided. So anyway, that being said, here we go. Randy, your number 5 drummer, classic era prog drummer.
All right. Well, I'll just got to preface this by saying, 1 through 5, obviously where I place these, I think are sort of arbitrary, but I'm going to start with what I would call somewhat of a wild card pick, which is Barrymore Barlow from Jethro Tull. I feel like his influence is more heard than realized, because I don't think among the classic names, he's not usually among the first group that people always talk about. But, you know, you have somebody who joined Jethro Tull, you know, basically from thick as a brick. So we're talking, you know, between 71 and 72, and was there all the way till about 1980. That's a lot of records there. And that's really like when you talk about the progressive rock era of Jethro Tull, at least the most noticeably progressive rock stylings of the band. He was there, you know, thick as a brick is obviously a masterpiece of the genre, you know, and then you get to Passion Play and all sorts of records. I mean, it's just so many albums, and the band was so prolific. So I think the key thing about him, if I think about the context of what was going on in progressive rock at that time, so let's say 1972, which is like, talk about a crazy year for just masterpieces all over the place, from basically every single band in that genre. It's like everybody was like peaking around that time, you know. But he, in context of the Jethro Tull music, I think what he did that kind of paved the way for people, you know, into the late 70s, 80s, and 90s is sort of like the hard rock element of Jethro Tull. Even prior to him with Clive Bunker, you know, on the first 4 Jethro Tull records, Aqualung, I think the song Aqualung and Cross-Eyed Mary, you know, I don't think you get to like Iron Maiden if those songs don't exist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So Clive Bunker paved the way. But with Thick as a Brick, Barrymore Barlow, I think, you know, the music got more hard edged. It got obviously a lot trickier, musically speaking. And he sort of carried that torch for like that combination of hard rock and almost like proto metal drumming. A lot of incorporation of double bass drumming, which if you think about a lot of the 70s guys, which we'll get to, many of them were single bass guys, you know, and he was very much incorporating double bass strongly throughout the catalog, all the way into one of my favorite Tull records, Stormwatch. There's amazing drumming on that record. Obviously the live one too, but yeah, I'm rambling here, but Barrymore Barlow, I think, is somebody who definitely, I don't think you get to like progressive metal stylings without touching on what he did, and then obviously getting to Rush. But, you know, we're talking a good 3 years before Fly By Night, which back then 3 years meant a world of difference in terms of where people were
back
pushing.
then everybody was doing 2 or 3 albums a year, so you could cover a lot of ground in
yeah
time.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just want to say I love the pick. I actually had it in my list and thought it was a weird pick too. But some fun stuff about him I'd read on him is that Jimmy Page actually considered him to replace Bonham when Bonham died.
Yeah,
I think that kind of says a lot about the way that he played and the powerful way that he played. Whereas I think Clive Bunker was more kind of jazz influenced and a little bit more loose. Barlow's got that tighter, that metal, that more intentional kind of heavy handedness and even spacing of his drumming. He also played on Yngwie's Rising Force album, which I love.
Yep.
It's just kind of a random fun fact about him. So
yeah, he played with Uli Jon Roth for a little bit from Scorpions. He definitely, like I said, kind of bridged that gap between like hard rock and metal into that progressive.
I don't think he's a drummer in the States that gets a lot of credit though. Do you hear his name often? I don't think
he doesn't get listed for like best prog rock drummer for some reason. I think actually both of Jethro Tull's drummers are 2 of the best. And I don't really understand why they don't kind of get that credit. I got to play Aqualung before Cruise of the Edge, and it's on the surface an easy song, but like when you actually study it, it's a really interesting, fun song. So I think they both deserve, you know. Their
Clive Bunker was amazing. And, you know, frankly, I mean, this I think gets into a bigger discussion about, and I think this would probably be a whole other podcast really, but, you know, the context, it's a bit chicken or egg, like the music versus the musicians. And, you know, what is it about Ian Anderson's writing that allowed for these guys to thrive? Or what was it about their playing that was able to influence his writing. So it's always going to be a combination of the two. And Jethro Tull, just by nature of, I think, Ian Anderson's brilliance, and they always had a stable of great musicians. I mean, you had to be in the band. But Mark Craney was awesome. Don Perry obviously was there. Probably, I think, the longest serving Jethro Tull drummer, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, I mean, all these guys really brought something to the table. I think it was Barlow kind of was there for the real meat of their discography.
All right. Well, that was good. Kyle, let's move on to the next decade. Your first pick, number 5.
Yeah. So if you'll allow me just a quick monologue, I feel like and you can cut it out later if you want. But for me, like if you're asking like who are the top 5 prog drummers from an era, so I'm looking at it 90 to 2005. It's super difficult. So I had some criteria. I don't know if you guys used criteria or if you just kind of went with it. I obsessed over this. Roie knows. Roy's never going to ask me to do one of these again. But I had 4 basic criteria. Maybe this sounds kind of like what you guys use, but the first is, for a drummer, for me at least, as a drummer, they've got to be musical. And I say it like this: they've got to. It's just as important what they don't play as what they do play. I think their feel and whether they make the songs better or not is huge. I think usually when you see these lists, I think people kind of condense it to who's the most technical drummer, which for me is probably one of the least important criteria. This is prog rock, so like everyone's technical, of course. But I don't think that just because someone can play like double paradiddles with their feet at 220 means that they're the best drummer of all time. So musical, technical. The third is influential. I've always said this of the best guitar player, the best drummer on earth. They might just be practicing alone in their garage. But I think for a list like this, it's got to be somebody who's well known. I know that's self-evident, but I think also needs to have played on some classic or essential albums. Yeah. And then the fourth criteria is that they're essential. I think that the band would not be the same without them. And it's hard to kind of put a thumb on exactly what that means, but just to try and make it a little bit more objective, that's the criteria that I tried to hold myself to. Because otherwise I would have people on here that I just like, or I like their music or something. But, right. Anyway, so with that in mind, Roie knows this. I messaged Roie. I think the top 4 of this list, when you look at kind of this middle era of prog rock drumming, I think is pretty cemented, and we'll get to those. But number 5 was like, it was like my rosebud. It was a struggle. So I looked between 3 basic drummers: Mark Zonder, Fates Warning, Martin Lopez from Opeth, and then Thomas Hawk from Meshuggah. So Zonder, he was on a lot of great albums: Parallels, Pleasant Shade of Gray. He was with that band from 88 to 2005. So he kind of like fits into that era. When you look back at like old modern drummer magazines from like the early 90s, he's the one that is being talked about a lot with progressive rock, along with Rock and Field and some others. But and then Lopez was with Opeth from 97 to 2006. He's on Blackwater Park, Damnation, my favorite, Ghost Reveries. And then Thomas Hawk, I think, is an interesting choice. If you look at like top drummers just in general, he's going to make one of those lists. He's a monster on the drums. But Meshuggah, I would say, is like really more a metal, extreme metal kind of band. Even though, like, when you look at the gent style of prog metal, it's rare that there's a genre that you can attribute to one single band. But with Meshuggah, that's what the case is. And so Misha from Periphery kind of calls them, they started gent. And so I think that's an important subgenre of prog these days. But ultimately, sorry for all that monologue, I decided to go with Martin Lopez from Opeth. And I think mainly, and this is where it becomes subjective, I just like Opeth's music more. And so I think Opeth, with that band, you see, in my opinion, the first prog metal band that really blends traditional prog with growl vocals and kind of more of the extreme metal patterns. And the thing I like about Opeth and the thing I like about Lopez's drumming is that they have such a wide range of styles, and I think he plays to all those very well. So he's very musical. And it's a shame that he's not in the band anymore. He's in this like Tool-inspired band named Soen now that's really good. But I miss him in Opeth for sure, even though I think they're great now. But I miss what he brought to that band. For me, Ghost Reveries is, I think, his best performance in that band. It sounds the best production-wise. And the song The Baying of the Hounds, I think there's like 9 or 10 like separate dynamic and musical variations in that song. I mean, I think it's like the encyclopedia of Opeth, if you will. It just has everything that they do great in one song. It's track 2 on that album.
That album was definitely my mind-blowing, like Opeth kind of, the gateway. I mean, I had heard Blackwater Park, I had heard Damnation, Deliverance, but I think Ghost Reveries was the first one that like I actually bought when it was new and came out and was really kind of anticipating it.
Yeah. All right. So jumping into my era, it was interesting looking at the modern era because I said, okay, I'm pretty confident Kyle's going to include Portnoy and some of these guys in his. Right. So I'm not gonna include Mike or, some of these names, and I'm going sort of really new, right? The newer guys that are covered more these days and, your modern drummer magazines and have started to pave the way with this gent albums and that kind of music. And they're playing bigger venues than a lot of the guys that we grew up to love and selling more records these days than a lot of the guys we grew up to love. So it's sort of an interesting period, but I'm going to start my number 5 choice. Is actually a guy that's known more for studio playing and has bounced around of late the last few years with a bunch of different bands, and he's becoming this sort of go-to guy for consistent great drumming, and that's Craig Blundell, who right now is touring with Steven Wilson and has become his go-to drummer, replacing Marco Minnemann, who toured and played with Steven for many years. He also plays with Frost. He's on the new Kino album with Lonely Robot, all that John Mitchell stuff. It does a lot of other studio work that we probably don't even know about, and really been around for a few years, but has made the bulk of his presence in the last really 5 years. That's when he's sort of all over the place and working regularly all the time. Tremendous drummer, just can do everything. Very dynamic with Steven Wilson's music, especially. It can go all over the place, and he could be as technical, and he can also play groove and some more simplistic, which Steven likes to do, switching music up at times. So that's my choice. Would be Craig Blundell. Someone you used to know. Randy, so you're up with your next choice, number 4.
I guess I put Carl Palmer in my number 4.
There you go.
Well, it's inevitable. I think that he has to be on the list. And, it's funny because among drummers, I think over time, he has been somewhat debated just because it kind of depends on what you look for in a drummer. I mean, in some ways, ELP overall kind of represents some of the excesses of the genre and all this kind of stuff, that they're like an easy target, I feel, when people want to point to why progressive rock got so, whatever people want to say about it in the 70s. But I think it's important to recognize that, they're kind of like, as a trio and coming out of like the psychedelic era, of like the Jimi Hendrix Experience and Cream and all of these kind of like power trios. Carl Palmer was really kind of bridging the gap, I think, between his interests and basically trying to be Buddy Rich. But also, what Mitch Mitchell and Ginger Baker and what those guys were bringing to like a rock trio. You got everybody's coming out of this jazz era into psychedelics, and go back to the Crazy World of Arthur Brown and the first Atomic Rooster record, and you hear Carl Palmer. He's like super young. He's like 18 or something. And he's trying to do more groove-based stuff. I think, admittedly, he wouldn't make the top 5 list of grooviest drummers of all time, but his ideas and the way he approached the ELP music, I think, is pretty undeniable. His technique was pretty astounding for the time, in terms of his hands, and his single bass work was very quick. And as a friend of mine pointed out to me, he was like really one of the first guys to introduce a lot of linear style drumming to the rock world. Guys like Steve Gadd and stuff, like, really obviously put it on a pedestal. But his fusion of like orchestral playing and jazz and rock into the context of that music is really, it's sort of its time, but I think it's also kind of timeless. And I listened to the live ELP record, the classic one, the triple live, Welcome Back, My Friends, recently, and his playing is just so on fire on that record.
I think his influence and the way he contributed to the songs by the way he played is as important as anything. And I think you're right. And he's maybe not considered top 5 drummer all time, that type of thing, if you took it as a whole. But just from that era and from what he was able to do, I think it's absolutely important and worthy.
So in looking at Carl Palmer, I think he'd have to be on anyone's list just for ELP and also for Asia. So we move on to the 80s, and he plays for like roughly 10 years and then gets back into the band, all that kind of stuff. But I'd kind of been reading about him, and it's interesting to me to look at who people consider to be the best drummer in the world at certain times, and how sometimes those people sustain that reputation. Sometimes they kind of lose that reputation. In the late 70s, Carl Palmer was considered like one of the best drummers, if not the best drummer. I think Neil Peart comes in and kind of takes that over. And then I think as Carl Palmer becomes the drummer for Asia, and it becomes less about the bombasticness of his drumming, and it's more kind of playing to the songs, and it's more about the 80s, I think he loses that reputation. For some reason, he never gets it back. But if you look at like his drum solos from the late 70s, and it kind of, Randy alluded to this, like at the time where it was a little ridiculous. He's got like 2 gongs and he's got a bell and he's ringing the bell with his teeth as he's hitting both gongs, but it's awesome. Like he's sort of like the Buddy Rich of prog rock. Like he's really, really technically gifted and just beating the mess out of the drums. I mean, he's in it. You see someone at their prime, and I think for him, it's the late 70s. And I mean, he's amazing. So like if he's not on your list, he should be, I feel.
Yeah, I would agree. He's awesome. And just as recently being on the cruise, I mean, performing the classic ELP stuff, and he's got a killer band with him, and he's actually doing all this great art stuff that he's doing, which is killer.
I mean, I think because I've heard people say, like, oh, imagine what ELP would have sounded like with such and such drummer. And it's like, okay, you can say that now, but you wouldn't even be having that conversation if Palmer hadn't been there to create those parts. So sometimes, like, if it's the execution of the parts that you get hung up on, so be it. And we could think of a ton of drummers that we would love to hear tackle that material now. But he was the guy, and he created those parts. And, the band would not have been what they were. I mean, you get Cozy Powell coming in the 80s, who I think is also a very important drummer. But just super rock solid. And I think after that, you hear Carl Palmer try to incorporate a little bit more of that thing into like 90s ELP. And I think admittedly just not as much his forte as the kind of early days of ELP and him like really stretching out. I think that's where he really made his mark.
Great. All right, Kyle, who you got next?
All right. So this pick is going to be maybe controversial. I don't know. But for me, I feel like he has to be on the list. And so this is Danny Carey from Tool. When I think of Danny Carey, I think of, and this is, I think, important too, of drummers, is that if you could play me 3 seconds of any drummer on my list, I could tell you who it was. And I think you can definitely say that of Carey. I think of like polyrhythms, tribal sounding drums, really odd time signatures. And he's such a powerful drummer. I think there's a few drummers you can maybe make a list of 5 or 10 that are just heavy hitters, like obviously Bonham and Peart, Billy Cobham, Dennis Chambers, some of those kind of guys that just beat the mess out of the drums. And Carey is one of those guys. And if you see him, I don't know how tall he is, but he's well over 6 feet, long hair, just an enormous guy, looks like a linebacker. And I think that plays into the way that he plays drums. And so I think the question becomes, and I'll put it to you guys, and maybe just yes or no, do you feel like Tool is prog as a band?
Well, I have my thoughts. I mean, look, they half are and they half aren't. That's just how it is for me. I mean, because here's the thing. I know a lot of people that like them, that like no other prog band, and listen to Nirvana and Soundgarden and this, and then Tool they love. And so I just think that's looking at it from a different perspective. And so I don't know how then they're a prog band. It's sort of a weird view of looking at it. It's very divisive, which I don't mean to be, but I think that there's sort of a difference there. Now, their technical nature is excellent, every member. And so the fact that they do these long, sort of almost conceptual albums and 15-minute songs and things like that lend to the prog fan also liking them. So I think they really ride the line well, which is partially why they're immensely popular. If for me, they're more of a metal band, but prog fans do like them. So that's, I don't know, Randy, if you agree on that, but that's sort of my take on them.
Yeah, I think you're probably, I think I would agree with that. I'm not that well versed in their stuff, to be honest. I mean, they're one of those bands that every time I hear them, I think Kyle is absolutely right. Like, within seconds that it's Tool, and that definitely has to count for something. But, it's almost like that. Where do you draw that line between like art rock and prog rock? If you want to talk about the classic era, maybe you could say the same for them. Nobody's really throwing the art metal tag around. I don't think that one's going to really stick. So I think prog metal will have to do. I don't even know how much they would consider themselves a part of it or not. But
I think that's the interesting conversation. Is I don't know this for sure, and I'm not the world's biggest Tool fan, but I'm pretty certain they would not think of themselves as a prog band. But I think they're one of those unique acts that sort of transcends genre, and their genre really is sort of like Tool. Like you hear of bands, they sound like Tool. Like they sort of are a singular thing. And I think there's sort of a mix of prog and art rock. I agree with you there. They even like tour with bands that are sort of like what I call like prog adjacent bands, like even Meshuggah.
Well, think about it like this. I mean, they're a band that could, back in the day, they may have played it or not. I'm not sure, but they could have played something like Lollapalooza next to Ice Cube and a band like Garbage, and everybody would love them.
Right.
Whereas you can't say that for most of the bands on Cruise to the Edge.
No.
You know, so they're definitely their unique sort of animal.
Sure. Yeah. When you look at who they've toured with in the past, it's pretty hilarious. But I mean, they also toured with King Crimson. Right. They toured with Mastodon. I saw them with Primus. So they definitely have a prog, nature. I think it's not fair to also discount someone's progressiveness because they're successful. I think there is that kind of, that thing where if they're too successful, they're no longer prog. I think people do that with Pink Floyd. They're like, well, they're not.
Well, look, the Tool is successful without intentionally trying to write a commercial. You can't accuse them of trying to write a commercial hit. I mean, they never have ever, and I don't.
Yeah, they're one of the few bands that can get away with like a 9-minute single, which is incredible. And I think it goes to show that context of it all is so important. Like if they wanted to call themselves a metal band first and foremost, then maybe the next step is to say that they have successfully brought progressive rock elements to a metal context, which might explain why that is seen as maybe more acceptable to their fans who might not like prog rock at all, versus a prog band trying to bring metal elements. I really do think there's a difference. And, I mean, this is like way left field, but like I love a band like Wilco, for instance, who
love Wilco.
I find to be incredibly progressive in nature. Nobody's going to call them a progressive rock band, but I think what they do and how they stretch whatever box people want to put them in is ultimately incredibly progressive. And a lot of times, I mean, if you go to see a live show, I mean, they'll take it way out there. But none of the people there, are going to be talking about whether or not they're prog rock or whatever. even though the I think the aesthetic of it is sort of built into some of what they do. So maybe for a band like Tool, it could be the case that maybe Danny Carey loves prog rock or whatever it is, and maybe somebody else in the band doesn't necessarily, and there's kind of a balance there. I mean.
As far as Carey himself, though, for your list, to me, he's the sound of the band. Him,
the bass player,
and he's amazing, and definitely deserves to be on the list. So I wouldn't have an issue with that at all.
I knew it would be somewhat controversial just because I don't even think of them as a progressive metal band. I just think of them as their own band. But I think when you're thinking, well, who's the most progressive drummer from that era, who progressed the art form, who approaches their music in an inspiring way that's progressive, I think really going back to like the original definition of progressive rock. I mean, when you think about these these pioneers of progressive rock, they weren't labeling themselves as progressive rock bands. They weren't on progressive rock labels. I think it was more about doing something different and innovating. I also agree with what Randy said. Wilco is one of my favorite bands, and no one in the crowd, they're more from an Americana post-grunge kind of background, and so, but they're super progressive. So I get what you're saying. I'll share this. Like I said, I'm doing these quintessential songs for whatever this is worth. Hopefully this is helpful. But if you look at the song Lateralis, and it gets talked about a ton, but this is kind of my best argument for them being prog is The song was originally called 987. It goes in a sequence of 9/8 to 8/8 to 7/8. And then it's also this whole Fibonacci thing. Have you ever read about this, Roie? So you need to study this song, and I don't want to go off onto a huge tangent, but look up on YouTube everything that went into the writing of Lateralis and how so the Fibonacci sequence is this mathematical thing. It shows up in like spiraling shapes, so ferns and pine cones. It's this idea that 0 and then 1 and then 1 and then 2. So you start adding the numbers in sequence, and so you go to 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, all this kind of stuff. But the short version of it is they incorporate all those numbers into the syllables that they sing lyrically and the drum patterns. And I mean,
well, now that's total prog right there. So
right. So you look at a song like that, and I'm like, well, how is that not one of the most important prog rock songs of that era? And the idea that they would even try and do that is, like, to me, the most progressive thing ever. And you really owe yourself to read on it.
Yeah, no, I think that lends it. That's definitely prog right there for sure. All right, let's move on. My number 4. This might be a homer pick a little bit because it's one of my favorite bands, and I think one of the best bands in the world right now, and that's Haken, and it's Ray Hearn, their drummer. But you know, he's a phenomenal drummer. I don't have a lot of sort of enormous backstory with him. I know he's one of the founding members of the band. He joined when he was like 17. He might not even be 30 years old yet, young guy. You know, he brings forward that old school Dream Theater style to his playing. Really great with sort of polyrhythms and changing time signatures and double bass playing and all of that stuff that Portnoy, he sounds like a new version of Portnoy to me when he plays. And super nice guy, British guy. It's sort of a short description there, but I've seen him live a number of times, and he's the most impressive person on stage to me when I see the band play, and they're a phenomenal live band. But you can just watch him the entire time. He's amazing. So I'm going to go with Ray Hearn, and you know, you can listen to stuff like what he does on the shorter songs, to a song like Earthrise, for example, which is sort of like this pop song, but it is super complicated, crazy drumming going on in the back of that thing. And that's tremendous. You can listen to the long 15-minute epics and he's shredding and whatever. But if you just listen to Earthrise and how hard that song is by itself, and it's impressive.
Yeah, I think so. I love the pick of Ray. He's on my list. I think what he brings is this classical music background. He's actually a really decorated tuba player. And so I think he brings to the drums this preciseness where I think I don't know if he mentally does it or if he writes it out, but he has an idea of every note that he's going to play, which kind of in some ways reminds me of Neil Peart, whereas I think Portnoy plays more kind of in the spirit of the moment. I think Ray kind of approaches it more maybe intellectually, if you will, and he knows every note he's going to play. And I think in that way you get these drum parts that are really amazing, almost like long solos. And like you said, on a short song, he has some beautiful stuff in there. So I think his drumming on Affinity for me is incredible, brings in the electronic sounds that I love, like mid 80s era Rush that most people hate, and I love it. Yeah. And so, I'm a huge fan of his. He's super talented. I think there's so much more that I look forward to hearing out of Ray because he's just, I think, endlessly talented.
Okay, let's swing back. Randy, number 3.
Phil Collins.
All right, I love that pick. Thank you for that.
Yeah, he has to be there, without a doubt. You know, Genesis, of course, but you know, Brand X. If you've never heard his drumming on the early Brand X records, you should definitely check that out, because what he brought to the kind of fusion context is really cool. The first record, Unorthodox Behavior, just him on the first track, just great stuff. And also that period there was kind of like a down period for Genesis, so he was just playing on a lot of different stuff. So
right.
He was popping up on Brian Eno records and Anthony Phillips and all sorts of stuff that he was doing. And to say nothing of that transitional period of the late 70s into the early 80s, where you really see his style shift to a bigger sound, more toms and just more of like a power thing. His drumming on the third Peter Gabriel record and all that kind of stuff, obviously into his solo career. I think the main thing about Phil, what he really brought to the genre, is a sense of groove. I think he had a groove that a lot of people in progressive rock in general, things often, you were saying earlier, Kyle, about like when people focus on the technical aspect of things. Phil was a pretty technical drummer, but he was also very rooted in a lot of groove, and much to the horror of progressive rock fans that would later discover his love of R&B and soul music and whatever. If you think about it, though, that's prevalent in his playing from the beginning, and I think that just the way he played, was just really groovy.
A lot of classic rock, I'll say generally from that era, was a lot of tom fills all the time, right? Even if you look at stuff Keith Moon was doing, or all those guys. What Phil was doing was it was more rhythmical and creating rhythms for specific songs that you had never heard before at that time, and even today still sound unique to me. Stuff like Watcher of the Skies, the thing that he plays throughout that song, a song like Down and Out from And Then There Were Three is really specifically unique to that song. The stuff he does in Supper's Ready. He was really inventive and stuck to within the song, but really inventive in his use of a hi-hat and different time signatures. So I think he doesn't get enough credit at all.
Yeah, I think one benefit of being a young guy, so I'm 33, so I did not grow up during the 70s, and I didn't experience that disappointment of Genesis becoming a different kind of band, or the same thing with Rush. And so I think I'm able to listen to these things with clean ears, and I love 80s Rush, and I love 80s and 90s Genesis. Like, it's not the same thing. It becomes, not prog, clearly, but I think, I think Phil Collins gets maybe a hard rap because most people think of him as a lead singer. But when I look back at Genesis and I compare that to the other, kind of beginning prog bands, I think his drumming stands the test of time better than anyone else's from those initial bands. So, ELP and, King Crimson. Yes, I think his drumming stands the test of time better. I think it's really tasteful. I think he's there. And I think the fact that he is a songwriter, I think, shows through in the way he drums.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I don't disagree with the things that you were saying, but that last point, and the thing too is, like, you can listen through all the Genesis records from, he's not on the first record, so from Nursery Crime up through, let's say, Abacab, right?
Yeah.
And the production style, they gets better throughout the years. I mean, that's subjective, but Trick of the Tail was the Genesis album that really, opened me up to their music when I was like in my early teens. And it's still, if not my top Genesis album, it's definitely a top 3. And I think his drumming on that album is just unbelievable. Dance on a Volcano, Los Endos, obviously. And his drumming on Robbery, Assault, and Battery always blew my mind. And but from that point on, the production style starts to get a little different. You start to hear the drums a little bit more clearly, and you end up with something like, and then there were 3 or some of his drumming on Duke, where there's still, it's like kind of the last gasp of them, you know, really doing progressive rock in their classic way. But he's incorporating that with kind of a bigger drum sound. And yeah, I think that his influence is it's undeniable.
Okay, Kyle, number 3.
Okay, number 3. All right, so I'm going to go with somebody that you guys probably know. This is assuredly a progressive rock drummer, but this is Gavin Harrison, best known from Porcupine Tree. I think the interesting thing about Gavin is you couldn't imagine him not being on this list, but when you actually look, so I'm looking at 90 to 2005, he didn't join Porcupine Tree until 2002. So you're talking 3 years, and he's only on 2 albums during this time period that I considered, and he's definitely in the top 5. I think that's super impressive. I think Gavin's drumming is singular. I think of control, precision. He's got limb interdependence, which is not just independence, but everything he plays with all of his limbs, it plays together. I think he's one of the best balanced drummers. He's a studio drummer, I think, more than anything. I think that's why he's so good. And I think of him, at least in this era, as when I think of linear type beats and bringing that to the forefront of prog, I think of him. Even just as an example, like David Letterman had some drummers on. He's a drummer himself, but he had some to play drum solos. You got guys like Neil Peart and Dennis Chambers, Stuart Copeland, and Gavin Harrison was one of those. So, I mean, he's kind of expanded himself as a name beyond prog rock in a way that we don't typically see. Obviously, he's gone on to play with King Crimson, Pineapple Thief. Randy, you may not know this, but he also played with a band called Lo-Fi Resistance.
Tell me about that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's been around a long time. This is, you talk about him being with Porcupine Tree just in that short period.
Sure.
But this is a guy that was drumming from the early 80s or before.
Yeah.
With a lot of different Italian artists. He played with Lisa Stansfield.
Yeah.
Iggy Pop.
Right.
And that's why he made the list.
Yeah. So this guy's been on a number of records, a number of bands, and is one of my favorite drummers to watch. I agree. I mean, he's just awesome. What was it like playing with him and having him on your record, Randy?
Well, I mean, it was an honor, and there's a big story to that we don't have time for, how we met and everything. But I remember just hearing In Absentia for the first time, and I mean, it's just such a great sounding record, aside from it just, musically being, I think, one of the best of the decade. But yeah, I remember hearing his drumming on that for the first time, and his just fluidity. There's just something about, his playing at the end of Trains or his groove in Sound of Music and all over the record.
That's my favorite drumming ever, is on the Sound of Music. It's the best. It's the best groove ever.
That's my quintessential song for him, for sure.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And what struck me about that is, it was hearing him on record was one thing, and the drums were recorded so well, and then obviously Deadwing as well. But I didn't see them live until the Deadwing tour, and that's where I really saw him open up live, and I had no idea what was under the hood. It was like the albums only kind of hinted at what he was capable of.
Yeah, he's a monster.
And then I think you hear that shift stylistically with Fear of a Blank Planet, where he really put his stamp on the material. And if you want to talk about being able to write music based around the type of people that you have in your band, it was very clear from that moment on that it's like Steven Wilson knew what he had in the band and what they were capable of doing musically with a guy like that.
Took the band to another level when he joined. I mean, the stuff before was great, and I love those albums, but it was another level of drumming, and it changed it changed what they could do musically. I'm going to jump in with my number 3. Again, continuing my sort of view on really sort of newer guys that haven't been around for that long, but this guy certainly has made a big name for himself. Is Matt Garcia from Animals as Leaders. I have a hard time pronouncing his last name. Look, he's only been in the band a few years. Joined in 2014. I think it was for their third album, Joy of Motion. But he's just amazing. Like every limb on his body moves by itself. He plays in a really unique sort of syncopation with the music. Very specific style that he sort of invented for himself. The way he plays, I've seen him do a drum clinic where he talks about that. Where he's not looking to just be rhythm, he's looking to actually play a part along to how the music is played. Really, just taking gent instrumental music that they do to another level. This band's immensely popular for a trio, him, Javier, and Tosin, who's a guitar hero for the new era. The fact that the three of them can go and tour and headline huge clubs and play, I mean, what they're doing is amazing. And so I think the influence comes from that right there. And he's going to be one of the drum names that's going to be around for a long time.
Yeah, I think he's one of the ones that's really changing the sound of drums. I think him with I don't want to name names because they may also be on your list, but certainly of the gent movement, these drummers that, you kind of look at like, through the 90s, you have drummers like Dave Weckl, who are kind of thought of as like the drumming gods, if you will, and they have like their DVDs that I would rent and watch and everything. You had some of the prog guys doing that, but now I think you have like the most talented, most technical drummers playing this, kind of varied prog music, which is sort of a unique thing. So you have this like world-class technical drummer in a band with world-class technical guitar players. And then also they're successful and they're instrumental. It's really a weird.
Honestly, it makes no sense. I mean,
it's YouTube, I think, as much as anything.
I've seen them play at this club down here in Florida that has, more alternative bands playing there and that type of thing. And we don't get a lot of prog bands down this way unless it's Dream Theater once in a blue moon, and a band like this with 3 instrumental guys shredding, doing the most complicated music in the world, selling out this club. And I'm walking in and I'm going, how does this happen? It's awesome. I mean, it's an incredible thing. And I my hat off to them. It's amazing what they're doing.
I'm a huge fan of his. I don't want to keep talking about him, but I like the way that he tunes his toms. I like the way that he and a couple other drummers have sort of innovated on cymbal sounds, and they're really short staccato sounds. And it just changes what they're able to kind of squeeze into drum parts. Some people probably don't like that, but it's super impressive. And I feel like I look at a guy like this, I think he's like 28, and I'm 33. I'm like, hey, who is this? It's just, it's crazy. I officially feel old when I see someone like that playing the stuff he can play.
All right, let's keep going. Randy, well, we're number 2 okay, let's see. Number 2.
All right. Now my number 2 is Neil Peart.
Not number 1. Oh my goodness.
Wow.
What will the people say?
What will they say? I didn't put him at number 1 mainly because, look, he's kind of late to the scene in a way. Yeah. 1974, 75. And you have roughly 7 to 8 years prior to that, depending on where you want to plant your flag for the earliest progressive rock. So for that alone, I couldn't see myself putting him at number 1. I think obviously I don't know what I can really say about him that hasn't been said.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of self-explanatory. I think obviously the influence, there's a certain marker that has to be placed with him, if not from the moment you hear his drumming on Anthem, on Fly By Night. If you want to move that marker a few years later, and drop it at Farewell to Kings or Hemispheres or something, there's something in particular from a Farewell to Kings to, I'm going to say, Signals, where their music was changing so rapidly. And I think all of those guys grew so fast through those records and really kind of charted their own course. I was talking to a buddy of mine about it though, and I think what's different about him is because of that few year difference between what you could call like the first wave of prog rock and whatever you want to place Rush, because some people debate whether or not they're prog rock, which is kind of ridiculous, but he was influenced by those first wave guys. So he loved Phil Collins and Palmer and Bill Bruford and all these guys. So, just that difference of a few years, I think makes a big difference. Not to mention that he obviously loved like Keith Moon and Ginger Baker and those kind of guys. So where his influences were contemporaries of each other, if that makes any sense. So, and I think that's kind of what makes him a little bit different. I think Rush, because of their production with Neil, you really get like almost the quintessential drum sound of where drummers wanted to take progressive rock, where you hear every single note and everything is like super precise, and just his ideas for fills and in orchestrating drum parts. He is really the guy that kind of like brought that all together. And in some ways, everything you love or don't love about where drumming in the genre has been since, I think it always is going to go back to him,
I just love his musicality. Yeah, I just heard the other day, I was somewhere, it's not like you can go a week without hearing Tom Sawyer somewhere. And, but you find yourself just air drumming the entire song just out of memory. And that's because of the brilliant songwriting that he did in that song. And, he's played more complicated things, obviously, that he's known for. But I just love just that song alone is a drumming masterclass, I think, in how to take a simple song and just make it badass. And
what's funny is Randy said this, I literally have written down, because Neil, I will say this, I don't know how he's not your number one. I can respect that, but still, I feel like he is the number one prog drummer of all time, for what that's worth. But I say on here, what can you say that hasn't already been said already? I mean, he literally, everything's been said about the guy. I will share like one quick little vignette is that we drove 8 hours to see them in Houston at an outdoor amphitheater, and they were doing like most of moving pictures throughout the show. And there was one song where he like made a mistake. And I was like, I've never seen him make a mistake. Of course, I'm sure he makes mistakes, but you could just see on his face, it kind of like flushed. And he was like, I can't believe I made a mistake, but I got to see them on the R40 tour, and he was just incredible. And the songs they were doing, I think Hemispheres for me is probably where they were really at their highest point. I think just his drumming on that is just out of control. Amazing. And then I like what they did with electronics. I mean, into the end of your little era here, like what he innovated with the electronics, I think is amazing. And I think he's also very wise that he's decided to step away from Rush at a time where he still knows he can play up to the level he wants to play. And this is the time to quit, because I think he doesn't want to see himself start to falter and not be able to play these parts. And I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Okay, I'm intrigued. What do you got for your number 2, Kyle?
All right, so you may have heard of this guy. I'm going to have a hard time pronouncing his name, but it's Nick DiVirgilio from Spock's Beard. I think Nick is on this list, and I'm guessing there's other people that probably wouldn't put him number 2. I couldn't think of him being anywhere else on the list, but it's probably because I'm such a big Neil Morris and Spock's Beard fan. And I think one thing that puts him on this list is drumming is incredible. I'll talk about that in a second, but how many other drummers could you think of that upon losing their lead singer and their primary creative force in Neil Morris could move from behind the drums and become the front man? Not that they were just necessarily like capable of it, but that they could own it and do that.
Just one more.
Just one more, Phil Collins, right? We've already talked about him, but otherwise it's hard to imagine even 2 or 3. I think that's how talented he is, not just as a drummer, but really as a multi-instrumentalist and as a songwriter. I've also been fortunate to see Nick in concert a few times, and there's just such a difference in the way that he hits the drums and he projects sounds, and his dynamic ability is just really, I would almost say, unmatched. I mean, he hits it hard, but he can hit it soft, if that makes sense. And so his sound is so clean. His chops are so tight, and he's got this sort of jazz fusion vocabulary that reminds you of someone like a Todd Sucherman or like a Dave Weckl. And he brings that into prog, and he doesn't sound wimpy or haphazard or ill-defined. He just sounds really solid. So he grooves, but he also can play in spots. And I don't know, I can't say enough good things about him. I think also when you look at this era, obviously he plays on, and I did use Roie, your book, just to make a little shameless plug.
Thank you.
The Essential Modern Progressive Rock Albums, great book. It's really awesome. But he plays on 3 essential albums, what you would call essential albums. And I agree with that too. So The Light, V, and then Snow, which is maybe my favorite album from that era. But he also helped bring Kevin Gilbert's posthumous The Shaming of the True to life. He played with Mike Keneally. He's gone on to play with Genesis, Fate's Warning, Jordan Rudess, Big Train, and then another band, Randy, you need to look up, The Fringe. They're great. This
is the Randy McStine podcast.
This is the Randy McStine podcast. I think he knew that. That's why he agreed to be on it. But what's it like playing with Nick, I guess? That's the obvious question.
Well,
man,
he's an amazing guitar player too, right? I mean, that's the other thing. He can play everything really well. Nick is immensely talented, but you know him better than we do. So share a story or two.
Yeah, I'm a little biased here. It's hard for me to put into words. It truly is one of the lights of my life to play music with him and to know him. And for me personally, like my association with him, really, I mean, it changed my life in so many ways and my career, so for that alone, it's hard for me to not be biased, but I was a fan first and foremost, though, and that's how we met. I was a huge Spock's Beard fan. When I was in my teens, I discovered their music through the first Transatlantic record because Neil Morris was the one guy in that project that I was not hip to, So this would have been I think 2000, and I was born in 88. So yeah, I was like in my early teens, and that first Transatlantic album I thought was amazing. And so I wanted to, go down the Neil Morris rabbit hole. And, hearing the Spock's Beard music was obviously a big deal, but it was what his drumming in particular, though, always struck me as incredibly musical and, technical, but not in a overtly kind of like a studying type of way. It seemed very natural and very flowing and just always like perfect for the music. And that's also the era too of like, gigantic drum kits and all this kind of stuff. And I remember opening Modern Drummer and seeing like he played like a 5-piece kit. And I was like, oh, how can you play prog rock with a 5-piece kit? That kind of thing, Yeah. And, but no, and you mentioned the Kevin Gilbert stuff and that music is life-changing for me. So, I mean, we met in 2009. I just reached out to him via email, like on his website, because I was working on the first Lo-Fi Resistance record. And I was playing everything on the record and then thought like, I was kind of hitting some roadblocks with my own abilities and creativity from the drum point of view. And I was like, man, wouldn't it be amazing if Nick DiVirgilio could play on this? And it was like a really big step for me to try to approach a guy like that, very much still in my fanboy phase and not having worked with anybody at that caliber. And, he was very receptive and that got the ball rolling. And now we play in a band together and I talked to him about an hour ago. So,
that's great.
So it's like there's a feeling though, whenever I'm playing with him or creating with him, it's so effortless and, we can really kind of take it about anywhere. So I'm truly grateful. To
I actually think
with him.
I actually think his drumming in Big Big Train is probably as good as anything he's ever done. Yeah. Also. So yeah, I think what impressed me the most, and I don't want to ramble on too much about him, but just that fact that he's amazingly good at everything. That's always, when I first was watching Spock's Beard videos back in the day, I knew he's a great drummer. Then he comes out and you see how amazing he can sing. And then he's doing these amazing acoustic guitar solos. And you're like, well, forget it. I give up. Yeah. I'm not playing anything anymore.
Yeah, Yeah, he's a full on, all around musician.
It's crazy.
And, he's the Prince of Prog.
Yeah. Prince of Prog. His music tastes are all over the place, which is great. And it obviously allows him to play, the most complex prog rock or tour with Tears for Fears for a decade. I mean, it's like,
right.
Yeah.
You can't say that about a lot of people who get known for one particular context and maybe they really shine in that one thing, but not something else. He's one of those guys that can pretty confidently walk into just about any musical situation and really own it, I think.
It shall be in the world what it shall be in the world. How can it be not what it is when it is? It's all that which exists best because it is what it is. All that it shall be in the world it shall be.
Okay, I'm going to jump into my number 2, and I think Kyle, you were probably referring to this guy when you were talking about the other guys like Matt Garcia that are bringing drum to a new era, which is Matt Halpern from Periphery. Yep. And another relatively young guy, early 30s, and I think he maybe was an influence on Garcia, sort of. And I know that the two bands have toured together and those guys know each other well. And this guy's just revolutionary in a number of things. I mean, not only is he an amazing drummer, bringing in these new techniques and new way of playing, but also started all these, doing a number of clinics and was one of the first drummers giving lessons online, and started this Band Happy website, which was I don't think is around anymore, but was trying to really encourage a new wave of musicians. And just really smart guy. I had a chance to interview him for my book, and just extremely intelligent and beyond just a drummer. This guy could run a record label probably one day. And, you know, and if you watch Periphery's evolution too, they're fine tuning themselves also and trying to write more melodic music and more concise music and structure their songwriting in a way. And he's going right along with that. And he often talks about how the main thing with him is the song, and not how, how much he can shred or how many, toms he can play in a song, but he can play everything, and he's extremely skilled and talented and musical, and a great drummer. So that's my number 2.
Yeah, awesome choice. I've gotten to see them in concert a couple of times, and he's another one of these guys. I mean, it's funny. He and Matt Garcia, I feel like they'll forever be kind of talked about in the same sentence, because they're very similar, and they have certain things that I like about each one of them, but they're really emblematic of gent drumming and kind of this high level of technical prowess and just doing things. I feel like they kind of one up each other with each kind of release. I think Halpern's the first, so I like him at number 2 above Garcia. And, he's got his drum sounds through Get Good Drums. He's got like all this stuff that he's recorded with Nolly, and he's got his own like entrepreneur like wing. And if you follow him on Instagram, he's kind of bouncing from one thing to another. So he sort of reminds me of like a modern Mike Portnoy, that he's got his hands in a lot of different things. Yeah. And he's just cool. The way he plays, it's really hard and powerful, but it's also really smart. Like, you'll listen to a drum part and you're like, what is he doing? And then you watch it and it's like, oh, okay, that's how he's doing that. I mean, he's one of these guys. He's always creative. He's always changing the way that I think about drums. And he's one of these guys that you can just tell the next 10, 15 years of his playing, God willing, will be amazing. Like, I'm excited to see what he comes up with and what that band comes up with. As we reclaim our position to
We know it's interesting. These guys, a lot of the drummers that are on your list have been around a long time, and so they've gotten involved in a number of different projects and side projects and super groups and all this stuff. It's going to be interesting to see, because like on my list, Hearn and the 2 Matts have just been in their bands, basically. Right. So it's going to be interesting in 10 years. Okay, are they going to start being in super groups and trying to do other things and make themselves, more well-known into other areas? And we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add here, because I'm realizing that with both of your lists that there was a certain period where I was really into the metal side of things, and I seem to have gotten away from it. And I think it's interesting to me that your lists both seem to signify this fact that where modern prog may be at in general is a more metal influenced
newer era, for sure. I think that's it's one of the things that I lament about sometimes is the bands like Spock's Beard and stuff that are the sort of last wave of bands that still sound like the classic prog bands, sort of.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's too many new bands like coming out in the last 2-3 years, for example, like that start out that way. I think it's more bands that start out this way, which, for good or for bad. I mean, it's a matter of preference, and they do what they do well. So it's interesting. I'd like to see more bands come out trying to incorporate that classic sound a little bit more as a new band. But you will see.
I think there's a lot of fans that want that kind of classic sound. To be honest, like you talked about Opeth, like the growling, like, yeah, I don't love it. It took me several albums to get to where I could listen to it. Same thing with Periphery. Like it's not my favorite thing. I like the more melodic section. So it does seem though that the growling, the more metal elements, there's a bigger fan base for it. So I think there's probably pressure to appeal to that. Maybe
it's also the influence of how these guys are young. That's what they grew up listening to, and that's their influences, right? I mean, there is something for that. So let's move on. Let's do the number 1. So I'm curious about what your number 1 is, Randy, but I might have an idea. So let's see.
Yeah, I had to put Bill Bruford.
Okay. Yeah, I can live with that one.
I thought maybe Mick Pointer, the first drummer of Marillion, but I thought, no, I'm just kidding. But there is something to be said for people who come first, though, in bands. Obviously, John Rutsey is always kind of like a punchline, because he's on the first Rush record, and then obviously Neil Peart did what he did. I think the thing about Bill Bruford that's really, well, first of all, I mean, look, yes, King Crimson, Genesis, his own band Bruford, and UK. All in the span of 10 years. That's a pretty undeniable run of elite progressive rock contribution, if you ask me. Yes would have been enough to cement his place in history, but it didn't stop there. And I think the nature of the fact that, this is a man who recorded Fragile and Close to the Edge and decided this band is peaking and we're not going anywhere from here. I need to get myself into a more interesting musical situation. Says a lot about his desire for pushing his own boundaries and creativity. And to step into King Crimson, which is insane, ready to reinvent his playing, and so Bill Bruford shows up in King Crimson, and Jamie Muir is this like mad percussion guy who is, completely changing the way Bruford plays drums. And then, Kyle, you were talking about Neil Peart's electronic use into the 80s. Bruford got there first. It's like, right. Just seemed to be somebody who, I don't know. It's undescribable what he really did. I think in a lot of ways, and some drummers can't really stand what he did, frankly. But I've always loved his sound and his approach and kind of endless creativity that he seemed to always be pushing himself as far out as he could go. And not always landing, which I think is also, though, like a really important testament to like his search,
I think that's a great take.
I mean, just drumming alone on Fragile and Close to the Edge is amazing and brilliant. And I don't think you can argue with that. I mean, Peart, Bruford, take your pick, I guess. I mean, that's some of the best drumming that's ever gonna be. But I think segueing into Kyle, your number one, which is also going to be up there probably in that list.
You might have guessed what I would pick. I mean, who else could I pick? So. Yeah. It's Mike Portnoy, and then I've listed out all the bands they play with, and Mike's is always funny because it's Dream Theater, Liquid Tension Experiment, Transatlantic, OSI, Neil Morse, et cetera, through that period of time. I think of Mike in that era as sort of like the Michael Jordan of prog rock drumming. He's just winning every championship during that time, in my opinion. I think objectively too, he hits all four criteria that I had. So he's musical, he's technical, he's influential, and he's essential to the success of his bands. And so certainly he surrounds himself with really talented people, and I think that's paramount to why the albums he's on that were so successful. I mean, he's playing with some of the best guitar players, some of the best bassists, some of the best songwriters in prog, but also he brings a certain, moxie or ethos to these bands that makes them great. Kind of calling back to your book, Roie, he, in that era, 90 to 2005, he played on 6 essential albums. It really should be 7 because 1 came out in 2004. I know you couldn't put every Neil Morse album, but for me, that's, I think, maybe their best album, and it should be on there. But anyway, closest next person on that list would have 3. Nick played on 3 during that time period. He was on 19 different studio albums during those 15 years. Here's probably the most ridiculous stat about Portnoy during this era is that he won Modern Drummer's Best Prog Drummer. It was 12 years in a row. So from 95 to 2006. I don't think that would ever be repeated. I think if you compare it to athletics, there really is just nothing like that. And so not enough that I could say about Mike and just the way that he drums. For me, he was my entry point into progressive. So that's aging myself, of course. But I went from Lars Ulrich is the greatest drummer of all time, straight into Neil Peart, straight into Mike Portnoy. And so that's kind of why I think I favor metal, is I really started in kind of hard rock metal. And as a drummer, I found my match in Mike, somebody that could not play what he was playing on certain things for sure. And for me, I think like his kind of high watermark is Liquid Tension, that first album, Paradigm Shift. And you think about like popping that CD in with headphones on the back of a bus headed to a track meet. That would be my experience. And just hearing those first like 30 seconds of that song, you're like, oh my gosh, like what is he even doing? So obviously influential in prog, outside of prog, and continues to be amazing today.
Yeah, look, there's not enough that can be said about Mike and his influence on the whole scene and the genre. I don't want to go into too much again for myself because everything that's revolved around the Prog Report and my book always comes back to some degree to Mike because he's been on every album. It's really impossible to get away from it. Yeah. But I think what I'll add to what you said, besides his ability, is just that by doing what he did. And supporting even websites like the Prog Report and what he does with Cruise to the Edge and his own cruise that he did with bringing on new bands, he's been one of the singular reasons to keeping the genre afloat and extending it to other fans and bringing his fans along and telling them, no, you should like Neil Morse, you should listen to this, and I think that's as important as anything that he's ever done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, to your last point, yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything that's been said, but I think that last thing is very important because he really does signify a certain gateway opening for so many people, keeping the genre going and keeping people interested in discovering things that that he really loved and that he thought everybody should know about.
Anybody that's a fan of his, I did a podcast with him where we just talk about cover songs that he's done, and he's done over 300 cover songs of different bands ranging from the Beatles to the Osmonds to King Crimson and so on. And that's a great one to listen to just because you hear him being a fan talking about the first time he heard that song and why it was important for him to do it as a cover and so on. So yeah, he's at his core just a music fan.
He's an encyclopedia
and a good guy. I've gotten to know him over the years, which has been amazing and just great, super nice. So Okay, I'm jumping to my one and sort of finish this thing off here. So I don't know if this is sort of a controversial one or not. I don't think it is, but I'm going to say Marco Minnemann is my I think the top drummer and really my personal favorite of the newer sort of guys. And I don't know if it's fair to call him really new because he's not 30 years old like some of these other guys, but I think the name that he's made for himself has really been in the last 10 years. Touring with the stuff he's did with Steven Wilson was amazing. He's been touring with Satriani for years on and off. Great, solo career. He has almost 20 solo albums that he's done. The Aristocrats, which is this incredible instrumental band with Guthrie Govan and Brian Beller on bass, and those guys are insane. And also really successful worldwide touring for years, which is awesome to see. And even has a great side project, Levin, Menem, and Rudis. They've done a couple albums back in 2016. They did one. I find the thing that really sets him apart for me is live. So on studio, he's amazing, but he still has to play within the song. Live, he's out of control, nuts. And I've been to shows where he played with Satriani, and Satriani is captivating in itself with, his shiny guitar and all the stuff that he's doing. And all you do is watch Minnemann on the drums. And he's awesome. His drum solos are amazing and creative and a trip to see. And again, he's another one of these guys. His solo records, he plays the guitar, plays the keyboards, he'll do some singing, can play every instrument, just ridiculously talented. It was either between him or Mangini to replace Portnoy for Dream Theater. But I do think Mangini was the better fit. I don't know how Minnemann would have fit in the strict, specific nature of what that band does, because he doesn't seem like he's one of those guys. But just the talent that he has is just so overwhelming. But that's my number one, and I think he's amazing.
So I love the pick. He's my number one. I love Marco. I think he's got such a sense of humor and such a creative way of approaching the drums. And so nothing he does feels like he's copying someone else. He's also not inhibited by any sort of technical deficiency. He can play whatever he wants to play. And I'll be honest, that whole Dream Theater, audition thing that they did on YouTube, I was like heartbroken that they didn't pick Marco. I felt like he was certainly the better pick. And I really, it's, I think, a shame what might have been, and maybe it wouldn't have worked, but, and I think things work out for a reason, but I remember watching that and being like, well, they got to pick Marco, and they didn't. And I was like, oh, this is crazy. So
guys, thank you. This was a lot of fun. I think this is really deep, intense discussion of drumming, which is awesome.
Hey, Roy.
And, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, and I know we've gone so long on this, but did y'all do honorable mentions at all? I feel like we should kind of we don't have to talk about them. Just throw out names.
If you want to just throw out names without going into a whole explanation I'll go for it.
Let's see. I mean, surely y'all have some from classic era. Do y'all have some like honorable mentions?
I think just generally, some names that I thought might be on there, and now they escape me.
For me, like Nick Mason, Pink Floyd. I know technically not necessarily there, but just he's the only member that's been on every Pink Floyd album.
I had him down. Yeah, I knew he couldn't top five, but I knew he he
I would say Terry Bozzio is one that we might have considered, his Frank Zappa stuff and all that.
Technically incredible. He played with UK as well.
Virgil Donati is still doing around doing some crazy stuff. Who else are we forgetting? I mean, Todd Sucherman from Styx is awesome.
Yeah, if you
not a guy a lot of people know, but he's amazing.
So I've seen a drum clinic with him, and he is incredible. I mean, one of the best drummers for sure.
Yeah,
I had a whole sidebar of only Zappa drummers because
Chester
Thompson, Ansley Dunbar, Terry Bozzio, Vinnie Colaiuta. Chad Wackerman gets into the 80s, but I don't want to linger, but I think Alan White needs to be mentioned. And I think that the context of other great progressive bands, John Weathers from Gentle Giant, BJ Wilson from Procol Harum, Guy Evans, Vandergraaf Generator, Christian Vander from Magma, that guy's like completely doing his own thing. It does go to show you just what the drummer's influence is on the music. And, some of these guys are not people that maybe stand out as technical innovators or what have you. But, the music that they're playing is very much tied to what they're contributing. And Nick Mason is, in a way, like the perfect example of that. I feel like he doesn't get the credit, like in some ways drummers don't give Ringo Starr credit.
Yeah,
it's like,
he's Ringo.
He's almost like the Ringo of the progressive rock.
He co-wrote Echoes and Time. He contributed like sound effects to a lot of. I mean, he's a big part of Pink Floyd. So,
and as a producer,
right.
Robert Wyatt, he produced a great Steve Hillage record. So he there's a lot more happening with him than he gets credit, I think.
Right.
Agreed.
Many more.
There's a lot. And so, we love all the drummers out there. We hope no one got offended. Anyway, guys, if you're listening to this podcast and you enjoyed this one, please check out our other ones. And there's more great ones to come. We got a lot more great guests coming on the next few ones over the next coming months. And we'll try and get some more programming up. Check out Prog Report Radio also for some great music and some of these shows. And, our YouTube channel, iTunes, Google Play, progreport.com, Facebook, and Twitter. We'll talk to you guys again soon. Randy, Kyle, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, guys.